Actually, in many respects, when we talk about ultra-low emission vehicles, we talk about the future and how we can make and help people do that switch in the sort of technology investment that we want to see. But actually, when you look back at history, what's really interesting is that from the mid-19th century to the earlier 20th century, actually, the electric vehicle was actually the king of the road. So over in places like the States, compared to their petrol contemporaries of the time, EVs were easier to drive, cheaper to run, and cheaper to maintain. And in fact, they were far more comfortable and reliable than petrol cars, and indeed far more popular. And actually, right up until the early 1920s, cities like New York had an electric taxi fleet. And in Europe and the States, major haulage firms were actually using electric trucks at the time to transport goods. And in some countries, you were starting to see exchangeable battery services to help motorists drive longer. And then, of course, things changed. And we all know where we are today in terms of petrol vehicles. And you have to ask, well, what happened? What happened to that early start in electric vehicles? And I think what you saw were three key things change that really switched things onto a different future path than the one they might have otherwise gone on. First of all, probably about a century ago, we really started to see an advance in technology. And obviously the internal combustion engine was developed and really started to dominate the market. But I think we also saw mass production start to drive down cost. And so combined with the fact that oil and petrol and diesel became very cheap, very affordable, with huge supply, those things suddenly brought a whole different kind of motor car into the market, competing at an affordable price for consumers in a way that they'd never had before. And of course then, there was the third change, which was on infrastructure and access to infrastructure. And I guess at a time when not everybody had access to electricity, the fact that suddenly you could get a car and fill it up at a local petrol station, and that you then saw government and private sector companies working together to help develop that network of petrol stations, you suddenly saw a real explosion in the number of petrol cars that were being used. And things changed then quite dramatically and for a very long time. But I think what's really interesting is if you look at those three things that changed everything for petrol cars, actually we can now start to see that they're starting to converge, I think, for ultra-low emission vehicle cars too, and vehicles generally. So first of all, we are seeing in this area a big and rapid leap forward in technology. I think it had a slow start, but the pace has now really started to pick up. I think for the first time, we are seeing reliable and viable choices for consumers in terms of their motoring needs today. And I just came past a number of all the same adverts for the Ampera car, which I'm going to try out as soon as I've finished giving this speech. And I think, you know, one of the most important points on that ad, which ironically was in the smallest font, was the fact it can go 340 miles. And I think those sorts of changes are really going to bring a whole range of consumers into the market that have been hard to persuade up until now. So we're seeing technology advance. I think the second thing that's changing is we are starting to move to more mass production. And therefore, you're seeing companies like Nissan saying that they think they're going to sell 1.5 million zero-emission cars by 2016. The fact that we have some of those cars being produced in the UK is just another reason why I think all of this technology and this switch from petrol to low and zero emission vehicles is so important for our country. And actually, Deloitte have said that eco-friendly vehicles could account for 1 in 10 of all new global car sales within a decade, which is really a challenging switch that you're starting to see. So I think mass production is starting to really drive down cost and make affordability less of a barrier than it's been up until now. I think the other thing I'd say is from a government perspective, greener motoring is also being made more affordable through some of the consumer incentives that we're trying to put in place too. So we have the government plug-in car grant, 25% subsidy up to a maximum of £5,000. And then this year, we also launched a similar grant for vans. Again, 25% of the purchase price up to a maximum of £8,000. Really trying to make sure that even with some of these earlier models that are still higher cost than perhaps conventional petrol and diesel vehicles, we can bring them within range of being affordable. I think arguably there is, as I recognise, a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, where on the one hand, the development of the low-emission vehicle market has been limited because we've got limited infrastructure. On the other hand, we've got limited infrastructure because people aren't really buying so many low-emission cars in the first place. So I think that alongside the grants that we've got in place, the Plugged in Places programme is actually quite important for the other piece of that, to try and make sure that we can really trigger that investment in the infrastructure that we need to help this market really take off. And I think all of those things are new. We're at the beginning of something that we haven't really had to do in the past, which is to dramatically change consumer behaviour in a market where they are absolutely used to driving one kind of a car, pretty much. And it's teaching us some really valuable lessons. So we're starting to learn what customers value in this area, where their key barriers are from helping them switch, not just in terms of the retail market, but also the business market. We're starting to get a sense of, I think, how that market segments around business and consumer, and then within the business market itself, how that segments between long and short distance journeys, vans, lorries, trucks. I think all of them will actually have probably a slightly different success story to help do this transition from petrol and diesel vehicles to low and zero emission vehicles. But alongside many of the things that government's doing, we have got this comprehensive strategy, which is around grants, around tax incentives, around investing in infrastructure too. And I think we are starting to see that pay some real dividends. And I think it is encouraging increasingly private sector companies to fund and build a network of thousands of recharging points at locations around Britain, including motorway service stations. So I think through this blend of government but also private enterprise, I think we really can start to improve access to a whole new low-carbon transport network where plug-in vehicles in particular perhaps can become what people see as a commonplace feature of this motoring landscape. And so really the point I'm making is this, that I think the factors that led to the rise in the dominance of petrol-powered vehicles are now starting to open up the road for low-carbon driving all over again. And I think we've got challenges to meet. I think we've still got some hurdles to overcome. And actually, when you look at the sort of consumer and business take-up of low-emission and zero-emission vehicles, it's been on what is perhaps a quite predictable innovation curve and adoption curve by consumers. I think we are moving along it steadily now. And I think that move and that shift from petrol and diesel to low and zero carbon vehicles is actually now definitely underway. And in fact, I would argue that if we play our cards right, we can really encourage it to pick up speed over the next 12 to 24 months. I'd also, whilst I'm here, like to recognise the work that has been done, huge work actually, on improving the efficiency of conventional vehicle engines and vehicles overall. For example, over the last 10 years, the average new car fuel efficiency has improved 30%, which is a dramatic improvement. And in fact, on average, a new car bought today is 23% cleaner than a car designed and built in 2000, which is really also a dramatic shift. So there's some brilliant work being done on conventional engines, but I still think ultimately if we're really going to meet our carbon targets, we're going to clearly have to harness a whole range of new types of motoring technology. And I've talked about our plug-in grants and the charging infrastructure that we want to see set up. But actually this government's been very, very clear that we are not going to be technology specific in how we see this shift happen. We think there's a market out there of different technologies. We want to do what we can to help that market develop naturally, so that consumers will have some real choice when they choose to make the switch. So, as I said, decarbonising road transport obviously isn't just about cars and vans we drive, nor is it just about the electric vehicles we may hop into. It's also about public transport and haulage. And we've been very keen in the DFT to not lose sight of that. And that's one of the reasons why we've launched a multi-million-pound green bus fund, a scheme that's helped deliver more than 500 low-carbon buses on routes across England. Much of that work often in retrofitting done by UK companies and UK people. We've also launched recently a low-carbon truck demonstration trial, £9.5 million funding to encourage and work with UK road haulage operators to buy, use and develop low-carbon medium and heavy goods vehicles, as well as the necessary refuelling infrastructure to go alongside that. And we've also, of course, got the renewable transport fuel obligation, which does reward genuinely sustainable biofuels, those that really do deliver greenhouse gas savings but don't cause undesirable effects on the environment. And as I said, I really do think we're making progress now. But there's, of course, another major reason why I think this whole area is so important, and why I think this staying with the status quo is simply not really tenable. Because perhaps as much as anything, what matters to the public, I think, is it's really far cheaper to plug in and recharge than it is to fill up at the garage. And for example, it's been estimated that a small electric van will typically cost around £100 less in fuel for every 1,000 miles driven compared to a diesel equivalent. And if you look at the Nissan Leaf, it costs £3 to go 100 miles. So dramatically cheaper than conventional petrol cars. So going green makes sound financial sense, and I think increasingly for the public that will become a more and more important reason why they start to think again, as I think we need to get them to, about doing that switch from their conventional engine vehicles that they drive around to low and zero emission vehicles. It's massively important also, of course, for our economy. We know that this market is absolutely huge. In fact, the estimate of its global value is that it's worth a staggering £3 trillion a year, and that market is forecast to grow by to well over 4 trillion by the end of this decade. This is a huge economic opportunity. It's incredibly exciting times, and I think this transition that we're witnessing isn't just going to be good for consumers, good for the environment. I think it's going to be hugely good for UK business if we play our cards right. And I absolutely want to see us at the forefront of the research, development and manufacturing of these new vehicles. It creates a window of opportunity, this technology change and the work that's happening. It won't be there forever. So I think the key to success is seizing the moment, grabbing a share of that green growth, making sure that those, as it were, green-collar jobs that are going to be created as part of it are created right here in the UK, and positioning ourselves as a global leader in this design, production and use of electric and ultra-low emission cars. I think it's already working as well. So we have Nissan building a plant to manufacture its electric vehicles and batteries in the northeast. And with policies that mean that Britain's really truly open for business, I believe that other investors will follow their lead, and certainly working alongside BIS, we are determined to encourage that investment to come into the UK. I think finally, it's important that we do this for the public as well as for industry and for jobs, because I think if we can deliver one thing that people would really value now, it would probably be to give them the choice to not constantly, and for businesses to not constantly be at the mercy of fluctuating world oil prices. And I think the option to be able to switch onto a cheaper motoring future, which is a brighter one for people and a low emission one and a low carbon one, surely has to be something that is a win-win for absolutely everyone. So to conclude then, driving from A to B and cutting emissions supporting public transport and helping the motorist, reducing dependency on oil and developing sustainable biofuels, boosting our economy and safeguarding our environment, none of these ambitions are contradictory at all. In fact, they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually two parts of the same transport coin. And I started off this speech by arguing that once upon a time, the future looked as though it belonged to low-carbon vehicles. And I want to end it up by arguing that I think history's turning full circle now. And just like the champions of the internal combustion engine a century ago, I think our generation, it's us, we have a golden opportunity to change the world and change motoring once again. It may not be easy, and I think these early days may have felt quite slow days, but I think it is happening, and I think it can be done. So my message is, let's go for it. I'll be right behind you all the way, and thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you.